Welcome, everybody, to Roll to Cast, the Australian Podcast Award-nominated tabletop RPG podcast of both actual plays and interviews with the creators. My name is Sean Flo, and I played Aurelius Tarnair on this here Witcher season just past, and I'm joined around the table by...
Hello, I'm Ellen Graham, and I played Eve of Urch, or Eve of Hirch, as I like to say.
Following the finale of our Witcher RPG season and our post-season wrap-up episode, we are continuing our inter-season content as we interview some very special guests. Firstly, he is the general manager of our Talsorian and the lead designer of the Witcher RPG. Welcoming back for the second time to this here pod, it's Cody Pondsmith. Hello!
Hello, glad to be back. Excited to talk about Witcher again.
Yay! I wish we had applause to canned applause to play, so it's just you're making your rapturous ascent to the roll.
It is our first two-timer of the podcast.
Yeah, you should be so lucky.
And also, it's not just Cody. We don't give you one Pondsmith this time. We give you two. And she is the business manager of our Talsorian and one of the lead writers for the Witcher RPG for the first time ever, Lisa Pondsmith. Hello, Lisa.
Hello.
Can you tell that Sean introduces wrestlers in the ring?
Oh, yes, I'm
Yes, I can see that.
Got flair. I like it.
Got flair and pizzazz. So for those who are unaware, if you've got the Witcher RPG book slap bang in the middle of your table right now as you're listening, you might see Pondsmith and Pondsmith, and that is indeed Cody and Lisa who are at the forefront of this here game. And so we have a lot to talk about. And I mean, first and foremost, what I would like to delve in, and Lisa, this is a question for you specifically. So Cody, take a seat. I'm using 3:30 a.m. energy here. I'm in a weird mood, but
it's like you're a cop.
Take a seat, sit back, relax.
Yeah, it's like you're the police chief in an 80s film, and you're like, give me your badge and gun and sit down.
I'll put my feet up.
Yeah. Lisa, I kind of wanted to talk to you just in regards to kind of where you got started in terms of your relationship with RPGs specifically, because I know that you talk about your time in meeting Mike when you were both in college, and this is in the 70s when, for my knowledge, D&D first enters around, which itself was an incredibly lethal system. So I was kind of keen to know about your relationship to RPGs and how that kind of grew and how you grew along with it to get to where you are today, working for Talsorian and starting to write yourself.
I started role-playing in my senior year at University of California at Davis. I fell in love with it immediately, and the next year, I moved into a household. I didn't know anyone. And one of the people said, well, what do you do when you're not studying? And I said, you're not going to know this at all, but I role play, because at that time, nobody did. And they said, oh, you have to meet our friend Mike. He does that.
Oh, my God.
So that's how I re-met him. We had run across each other on campus earlier, but this is my first real introduction. So he ran in my world, which I then threw myself into creating after I discovered role-playing. And that's been a major part of my life all of this time. But it was in 1985 that we started putting together the company. And I didn't trust anyone else to do the business side of it.
Not even Mike.
Especially Mike.
Well, he had all these things he wanted to do. And I said, no, nobody else is going to put as much heart into this as I will. So that's how I became business manager. Now, at that time, we had other jobs. And it wasn't until I think about 5 years later that we were really starting to become smaller than a closet company. And I said, we're going to have to get somebody else to work on the business because there's a lot going on now. And Eric Goldberg from West End is a friend of ours. And he said, who is going to take care of your company better than you? So I quit my job.
Oh, easy as that.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Go for it.
So we had some good years there in the 80s and 90s before the industry collapsed. And Cody came about during that period.
Do you mean he came into existence?
He
or
was
he
my
came into the
greatest
company?
contribution to the gaming world.
Ah.
Oh.
Okay, I don't know how to feel about that.
I was honestly expecting that segue a bit earlier when you were like, who else is going to run this company? So we had a small child.
Well, he didn't even exist, so we couldn't put that on him. Yeah, when I found out I was pregnant, we sent out a product sheet to everybody in the industry. And
yes, indeed, I do have a product number.
How very cyberpunk of you.
I'm trying to remember, it was one of the distributors who wrote back and said, we are interested in the product, but we understand that it will be pricey because there's only one of them.
Aw.
That's so sweet.
I love email humor.
How did you stack Cody?
Oh, I didn't. It was simply a product, what we do when we send out a new product. So price, a stock number, the price was TBD. So
I'm kind of curious there for a moment.
I've actually still got that piece of paper, by the way.
Oh, that's so sweet.
The industry collapsed. We moved up to Seattle from California, and Michael worked various places in electronic games.
I was going to say, because he worked with for Microsoft for a while and a few other places and
Yes,
started
he
working
did.
on video games, yeah.
As happens with many people who have worked by themselves or had their own company, he did not like working for other people. So it looked like the industry was building back up again. So he said, why don't we do this? It's a lot more fun than you working slave hours for the electronic industry.
Yeah.
So we did. Cody, as he likes to say, came in the mailroom when he was about 9.
Oh, wow.
It was because at that time we were still so small and I was packing all the orders.
Well, you've got 2 extra hands there.
He has been designing games forever. I remember, and he was in elementary school and he was running his friend in games. So that's kind of, perhaps it is genetic. I don't know. Anyway, to our discussion here, we can flip forward to 2012. CDPR wrote to us and said, we love Cyberpunk and we want to do a video game. Nobody knew anything about them, but what we found was that they were really fans. They knew the property and they wanted to stick to the property, and that's what we wanted to hear. So somewhere in there, I was talking to them and they said, we've decided we think there should be a tabletop role-playing game of Witcher.
Ah.
Who do you know anybody who would want to do it?
Do you know anyone who works in the TTRPG industry? I don't.
Michael said, I don't do fantasy, which is absolutely true. So I turned to Cody and I said, do you want it? And he said, yeah.
And just for reference, this was when you were a teenager, Cody, am I right?
He was 18.
Jeez.
I was 18 when I did the pitch, if I recall correctly.
Yes.
This came up a little bit beforehand because that leads into the whole process of that pitch and everything.
He got off a plane after flying from Seattle to Warsaw. We drove to the offices. He sat down on the sofa in the lobby and talked to like 4 different people, giving them the pitch. And then it was his. So, my husband makes a point of saying, Witcher is all Cody, all the way down.
And I mean, that's an interesting thing for me, if you don't mind me interjecting. I have a curiosity about Cody, because obviously you've grown up in a tabletop household. Your house is basically a big role-playing table. But you're surrounded predominantly by a company whose bread and butter up to that point was Cyberpunk. That's what our Talsorian's known for. It's a very sci-fi, dystopian, future-heavy environment. Did you find yourselves drawn more towards fantasy? Because obviously your love of TTRPGs in general comes a lot from your parents, but where did the love of fantasy and looking into kind of high adventure rather than Cyberpunk kind of come from?
I've always had I don't know. I'm a very adventurous person. My primary hobby outside of TTRPGs is hiking. I love getting out into the wilderness. I have a fascination with a lot of the sort of pre-gunpowder warfare, swordsmanship, things like that. So a lot of my interest just kind of circulated around fantasy. I don't know. I could like pinpoint a moment, but I've always, while I like sci-fi, I've always had a real love for fantasy, and I carry that through a lot of the stuff that I do. Everything from a bunch of sort of the outdoorsy stuff that I do. I've threatened my personal gaming group a million times that we should someday go out and do a hiking camping trip.
Don't do that to nerds. They think of the SPF required.
I've threatened them that we should do a hiking camping trip, and I'll take all the gear that our characters carry and see what it's actually like to, travel on the road.
Let's really deal with encumbrance now.
Yeah, I was going to say, you all have encumbrance.
Encumbrance. Nobody uses encumbrance.
Yeah. But in Witcher specifically, it was actually because when they approached us for Cyberpunk, they sent us copies of Witcher 2. And I sat down and played Witcher 2 and really, really enjoyed it. It's one of the only games I've played twice because I didn't like the ending I got the first time. And after that, Lisa more voraciously than I perhaps, started reading the novels and got really, really just into the world of The Witcher in general. So when they came to me with this, opportunity of doing the TRPG, I was like, yeah, absolutely. By that point, I just really sort of fallen in love with the world through the video games and the books.
Just jumping off of that. So you're in this environment, but I think in an interview previously, you've said, Cody, that Witcher and Cyberpunk mirror each other. When you were kind of going into to make The Witcher, is there like a central kind of theme or identity or thing that you like to see in your games that you're kind of pushing forth? Apart from them both being worlds where kind of good people suffer, what's your kind of, just unpack that sentence for me a little bit, if you wouldn't mind, if they're mirroring each other, because I find that very, very interesting, especially since we've had the good fortune of playing both.
What I generally meant by that is that both Witcher and Cyberpunk are, for all of the sort of like edgy baggage that comes with it, they are both dark settings. Cyberpunk is a dark future, Witcher is a dark fantasy. And I've always kind of seen both of them in a very similar way of, it's not necessarily that they're super, horribly grim or like very everything will fall to naught kind of, hopeless. But both Witcher and Cyberpunk have, I think, if you do them right, they have this core concept in a lot of cases of you are not a hero, really. Your goal is not to save the world. You're not necessarily like stopping a cult from, bringing back a god or, defeating the evil king. Or if you are, you're doing it because it has some personal relation to you. Both Witcher and Cyberpunk are this setting where you are playing not regular people exactly, but you are playing a person who is trying to live in this inherently very dangerous, very grim world. And your goals are centered in most circumstances around you. In Cyberpunk, you are living on the streets, usually in Night City, and your goals center around surviving to the next day and eventually making it. The dream of most edge runners is, making it to the point where you did the last big score. You got rich, you got the condo in the best part of the city and a great car, and you don't, theoretically have to throw yourselves into horrible situations constantly to make the money to survive.
You became a member of the ruling class.
Yeah.
Effectively. And to some extent, in a lot of cases, the same is the case in Witcher. The Witcher has a bit of a different thing in the current time period in 1272 when we wrote the TRPG of it is genuinely this weird situation of survival where, you are struggling to make your way so that you and your own, as it were, are okay. There's a lot of intersections of that. Like if you are, elder folk, you are an elf or a dwarf or a gnome or a halfling or something, you are dealing with, in certain places, this prevalent racism that will affect you very personally, you and your family and probably your friends. If you are living somewhere in the north during this time period, you are escaping absolute, total warfare. But all of this is carried forward by you having a life that you can live in a, at least reasonably safe and happy way. Geralt, for instance, most of his, while Geralt is dragged into big political stuff where he's assassinating kings and, helping people fend off, massive world-ending threats or whatever, his through line is basically always personal. Geralt is dragged into those situations not because he has any direct interest in saving the world or, overturning corrupt kings or anything like that, but because he has, somebody he is looking after, or he's looking after himself, or, those sorts of things. And it's not necessarily about being sort of like selfish out for yourself. It is this story of somebody trying to live in an inherently threatening or dangerous environment. And I think one of the cool things about that setting is that both in Witcher and Cyberpunk, you walk this very fine line between extremely grim, where, you are, going into horrible, acrid swamps and hunting down twisted monsters that have stolen children to eat their bones or what have you. And then you kind of get to balance that with these moments of peace and serenity where perhaps you and your company, as it were, have, stopped in a tavern and you're just enjoying the music and playing some Gwent. It's this balance between really terrible things that you are kind of trying to get through and these moments of happiness, as it were. And both Cyberpunk and Witcher really kind of have that weird balance.
It's something that I find phenomenal just listening to the two of you kind of talk about this, how you can kind of expound so eloquently and so like with such knowledge about this subject, about the Witcher world and its lore. And I know you've talked about, Cody, you had more of at least a bit of an into the video gaming side of The Witcher, whereas for you, Lisa, you tackled the books. And so, to the point where you have literally pulled out a highlighter and you're bringing up anything that even remotely resembles lore. But when you're tackling something that has such a big kind of world over a multiple kind of a variety of mediums, what did you find was the most difficult aspect of taking an existing property and kind of collating all this information and trying to make it into a brand new product?
I think part of the problems come from the fact that to write a game, you do not have to create a world. You have to create a background for your game. But as a RPG, we have to create the world. We have to allow you to wander around in the world of The Witcher, which means that, for example, I did a section in the core book about each of the countries. Well, there wasn't a whole lot of information. So we had to take what we had and sort of extrapolate that from everything else that we knew. But we tried to stay as close as possible to the property.
The other problem is that, as Lisa was saying, we didn't have a lot to go from. And it could be even more difficult because sometimes we didn't even know if we could go from the things we had to go from. We had a lot of discussions in between me and Lisa on Core Book of what content we could and could not use because by the very nature of the Witcher franchise, a lot of different products and a lot of different sources of lore are held by different people legally. So there was a lot of information that came from, for instance, like the old Polish TRPG, one of the two, and that's not stuff that we could use. So we would run across like this. We'd run across this vast source of information and be like, yes, we have this information that we can put in. And then we'd see it was from the Polish TRPG. And immediately, like, all of that, it would just, like, disappear, as it were, because, we can't use it. Like, we legally cannot use that content. It might as well be gone to us.
Like a poison apple it is.
You hit this crux because in a lot of cases, there aren't super well, it's hard to track down everything. Because we're talking about all of Andrzej Sapkowski's books. We're talking about all of CDPR's video games, both the ones on console and things like Gwent and the old Witcher Battle Arena game and stuff like that. And then, we're talking about old Polish comics and new Dark Horse comics and old Polish TV shows and an old Polish movie and two old Polish TRPGs and, books that were written by people other than Sapkowski, but Sapkowski kind of like gave them their blessing to write it. So there's such a wide variety of things, and it's in many ways, it was kind of difficult sometimes to determine what we could and couldn't use based on those sort of, legal agreements of what we did and didn't have in our canon.
I'm curious then on what really excited you most about The Witcher from pouring, this is a question for you both, from pouring through all that pre-existing material, and what were the things that really stuck out to you? This kind of like, I was hearing you, Cody, talk about you creating or elaborating more on the Griffin School and you wanting to create a real kind of a real hero in this world. But what are those little elements from The Witcher that you're like, oh, we've got to have that. We've got to have that because that is integral to making a Witcher world.
I have always been the fantasy person. I run fantasy games and I love to play in fantasy games. Although I found an interesting dichotomy. I believe that some people are GMs and some people are players.
Yeah.
I am a player. My son and my husband are GMs. They get restless in other people's games.
It skips a gene.
I think I loved the fact that The Witcher was a really rich world. There was so much going on. And I give Sapkowski credit because by hooking him up with Ciri through the law of surprise, he's dragged Geralt into the world situation without it actually being Geralt being the hero to save the day. I'm thinking about what seemed the most important when we were doing the book.
I'll jump in here and say that I have a very similar opinion, which was that, especially reading through the books and going through the adaptations that CDPR has done, it really stuck out to me how much the Witcher world is like by right, everything about it should be an extremely generic sort of Tolkien ripoff,
Yeah.
It's elves and dwarves and humans, and they're on it's sort of a continent coastline that disappears off into the east, and all this. But a bunch of the choices made by Sapkowski and later CDPR really take it. They elevate it from this sort of fantasy heartbreaker elves and dwarves thing into its own world that genuinely feels unique. Many aspects of Witcher feel unique, and they have this very interesting, in a lot of cases, sort of almost folk fantasy vibe that it's kind of low fantasy and dark fantasy kind of mixed together, which is, one of the things that I thought was interesting, and I wanted us to carry forward. I wanted to make sure that in the game, it felt like the book. So it was saying, it didn't feel like you were, sort of in the big damn heroes category, because like in the books, for instance, while Geralt is an incredible killing machine in a lot of circumstances, all of the monsters are also incredible killing machines.
Yeah.
So, Geralt can wade through humans with barely any problem in most circumstances, but Geralt gets beat up a lot in the books by various monsters. He takes a serious beating, which is why in a lot of cases we kind of relate him almost to like a film noir hero, as it were. But Lisa, you were saying?
What we needed to get across in the game is that Geralt was created to fight monsters.
Yeah.
He wasn't just created to be a badass. There was a job. There was a horrible possibility that somebody could do a tabletop and it would just come out to be fantasy.
Yeah.
Fantasy in quotes. So Cody and I really pounded hard on the idea of what is this in The Witcher? Like I said in the book, we tried to make it as witchery as we could possibly make it, which is interesting because CDPR makes their world very cyberpunk. And the people at CDPR and Michael talk and make sure the worlds are connected and consistent. We just have it sort of the other way around.
Yeah. But like, for instance, to jump back, you mentioned Ireland. I may have talked about this in the past. When I set out to make Ireland, I wanted to make a character who was genuinely a knight. like a real, knight in shining armor. They're not cynically fighting monsters just because it pays or, whatnot. They want to protect people. But at the same time, I knew that story couldn't end happy, because it doesn't. Because, the nature of Witcher, real, genuine, idealistic heroes do not usually get happy endings. You know? So, I knew when I started writing Erland that, the end of his story did have to at least be melancholy, which is why, Erland, for all of his sort of heroism, the end of his story is, basically him leaving the continent because, everything he put together to protect people has been destroyed because a bunch of mages wanted his library and he didn't give it to them. So they basically destroyed everything he cares about just to spite him, effectively.
That's a mage thing to do.
Yeah. And it's why I really appreciated the stuff they carried forward in Gwent, where they talk about the fact that Erland was the Griffin School was the only Witcher school that was going to kings and saying hey, if you fund us, then we'll be able to help everybody, and we won't have to take the few coins that a peasant in your country has just to kill the monsters they have, just to fix our gear. But despite the fact that he implored all of these different monarchs, none of them ever saw a substantial reason to do it, because they had the money to pay for Witchers, and who cares if other people don't have the money to pay for Witchers. So, like I said, when I built Erland, I wanted to build this character who was real and genuine, but I knew that by the nature of what Witcher is, that kind of character could not really have a happy ending in a way.
I think it brings up another interesting point. We talk about the things that make the Witcher, and obviously Geralt is one, and another one is indeed the monsters that make, and a big draw of the Witcher series and being able to play the RPG is being able to come up against this cavalcade, this menagerie of different terrifying creatures. And for Lisa specifically, as someone that I'm beginning to learn is kind of a jack of all trades, and you've kind of had to bounce around and take a lot of different roles in the company. It's interesting to see that you talked about being at the University of California. You studied zoology.
Yes.
And so I just wonder whether that kind of interest in the science of animals and such, did that interest get piqued when you're kind of looking at the monsters and how to write them in the different variations? I'm just wondering if there's any connection there.
Quite possibly. My interests are extremely broad. I did go to school in zoology. For some reason, as a child, I thought I really wanted to be a vet. Once I got 2 or 3 years into my degree, I realized that there were a terrible lot of people who wanted to do the same thing, and they were far more dedicated than I was. So I realized that goal was not a good one, but yes, that information is still in my brain. But then also, I'm a big history buff. So that stuff is in my brain too. Even little things like I spent 10 years as a baker, and that's in there too.
Can you elaborate on that? Where does the baking come in? Because I want that Witcher side game.
After Michael and I left Davis and went to Santa Cruz, I wasn't sure what to do with myself. I had decided that zoology was not going to work out for me. So the obvious question when you're in that position is, what do I enjoy doing? And I enjoyed baking. I had been doing that as a little girl in 4-H all the way up. And there was a really good European-style bakery about a block or two from my apartment in Santa Cruz. I went in and said I was looking for a job. I wanted to be a baker. And the wonderful lady that owned the bakery looked at me and she said, well, you're big enough.
Oh.
Little did I know that commercial baking is an extremely strenuous job.
Okay.
I went through starting with dishwasher and worked my way up. And I enjoyed it for a very long time. But once again, I have these periods in my life when I'm doing something and then I realize that I really need to be working on the company. So I quit and go do that. But Yeah, it was a good time.
So what is it then that makes you decide, or at least what is the impetus to go, oh, okay, I've done the business side of Talsorian for a long time. I want to try my hand at writing. Because I know your work on The Witcher isn't the only thing you've written for with Talsorian, whether that is Falkenstein or whether that is Primitive Screwheads. Like you've obviously delved into that quite a bit. What kind of sparked your interest there?
Actually, I got to write a lot of little pieces for Cyberpunk. I have always written, but not for publication, just little fiddly things. I'm terrible at plotting. That's why I'm not a good GM. The products were always there. They were always in front of me. Michael has encouraged me to write for years and years. He has said, I want to get somebody to do more of your job so you can write more. But right now, the business side of the company, because we have 6 creatives and me, the business side of the company does require my full attention.
The hit new TV show, 6 Creatives and I.
One thing to remember is that back in 2012, when Cody pitched The Witcher, there were 3 people in the company, and they were all named Pondsmith. So
it is not an exaggeration to say that the Witcher TRPG core book was basically put together by me and Lisa, and basically no one else.
Wow.
Despite the fact that it's you pitching an 18 and going forward, but the idea of it going, right, this is just you two, you are just going to be in charge of this. Is that freeing or harrowing or a nice, lovely mixture of the two?
It's definitely a mixture of the two, and it definitely, to some extent, my experience speaks to how young I was when I did it, because this was the first major product I worked on, and I wanted to have my hand in everything, and be able to really do this the best that I could. And I did all the system stuff. I put in changes from playtest. Lisa provided me with copious notes on everything and wrote the world sections. And I sourced the art from CDPR, who was nice enough to give us all of the art from Gwent and from their concept art for Witcher. And I even did the layout for the core book. And, all this stuff. And in one respect, it was very freeing because I was able to kind of, move forward with it as I, saw fit in most circumstances. But on the other hand, besides having Lisa there to help me on the lore side, I had very little backup, as it were. Together, me and Lisa put together a 336-page book over a very long period of time. And, I kind of came out of the end of that. And, I will admit the first printing had a lot of problems. And, we diligently sat down and fixed those problems. But looking back on that, I have thought in the past, I was so invested in doing this all, me and Lisa doing it all ourselves or whatever. And I just don't. I realize now I do not want to do that again, because the stress of putting together, a 336-page book for a very popular franchise, just 2 people, is absolutely massive. Yeah. And, especially when you're doing kind of everything. Like I said, we didn't have a layout person, we didn't have an art director at that time. None of that. I like to say, I, for the first, and I'll throw myself under the bus here, for the first book, I laid everything out because I wrote into layout, which anybody who's done, book design before will probably be screaming at whatever they're currently listening to this podcast
on layout.
So I had, I wrote all this into layout, and it wasn't until quite a long time after we finished the core book that I learned how to flow text in InDesign. So I was just making every text box, and I didn't know how to flow text from one text box into another. So I was just there were 1,000 things I learned after I finished putting together the core book for the first time. And I was like, wow, if I had known this, the whole process, if I had had an actual layout, designer, maybe this would have been a lot easier. So
Cody, when you ran across those technical problems, did you ever consider going to your dad? saying, "Hey, what's the best way to do this? You've been doing this for 30 years."
Why didn't you ask your dad, Cody?
Answer your mum, Cody.
Part of it is I was, 19 or 20, and I really wanted to prove myself. And, Mike was busy with other stuff as well, but I'll admit it. I'm pretty sure it's just that I really, really wanted to do it all. I think when you're doing your first big project, there's a lot of push for that. There's this you want to do it all. You want to prove that you can do it or whatever. And luckily I've largely gotten over that. But yeah, no. To answer the question, it was very freeing in one respect, but it was also just wildly, intensely stressful. Also, I have to jump back and throw Lisa under the bus now.
Oh, great! Please do.
I was just getting ready to throw you under.
Oh, okay. Well,
we can all do it.
Go ahead.
There's enough room under the bus for everybody. No, Lisa. I wanted to get Lisa writing on Core Book because she is a really good writer. She is a really, really good writer. I had her writing both the world section for Witcher TRPG, but also quotes from, we had these two narrator characters, Rodolph Kazmer, the Dwarven Merchant, and Brandon of Oxenford, the Human Scholar, with Rodolph basically being sort of my side of things, talking about the day-to-day, traveling across the continent type thing. Brandon being the very sort of scholarly, talking about the high concept stuff. And going through and doing that process with Lisa was really fascinating because we have these two very different voices. And all of Lisa's writing for Brandon was delightful because she really just channeled this very grumpy, sort of crotchety old scholarly man who I would get to sort of bounce off of as this very sort of, affable but cynical traveling dwarf merchant. And the kind of byplay there, even if it doesn't show up in the text, there was this fun byplay of just us understanding that these two characters knew each other and were kind of doing this narration together and would reference each other sometimes. It was a real delight. Anyway, I relinquish myself. Throw me under the bus.
Okay, bring under the bus. We released this book at Gen Con.
Yes. Oh, God.
And he knows what's coming.
Yeah,
Cody said, before the show opened, he said, "I just want to sell one book."
It was the first thing I'd ever done.
The show opens and we're selling books, and somebody from Gen Con walks up and says, "Can you manage your line, please?" and
we were in, okay, this important context. We were in a 10 by 20 booth that was towards the back of the hall, and we could only see a certain amount of the line. So this woman comes up, obviously quite irritated, and says, "You need to manage your line." And I'm like, "What?" And I went out, and the line, yes, indeed, went basically around the corner and then went down the hall, and went down probably a solid 40, 50 feet of just people just lined up. And I was stunned by that, but at the same time I'm panicking because
you're 20.
I was 22. I was 24 or something, and what we got was basically, "You need to manage your line or we're going to shut you down." I was like, oh. So this leads to we had to manage the line, which was so far back that we had to run down to it, and we had to set a cutoff point and have people wait against the back wall so they weren't interrupting the walking area. So for a period of time, I'm just I am sprinting back and forth between the end of this line and our booth. I put up a sign and everything. I'm going back and forth. I'm going to people at the end of the line, "Don't worry, we still have copies. You'll be able to get them." I'm running back and forth. And funnily enough, a couple months later, we're trawling social media. I think it was Facebook. And somebody said, I was in the line to get a copy of Witcher at Gen Con. And there's this guy who is running back and telling people updates about the game. And I didn't know that was the lead designer.
Cody will tell you that it has a lot of problems, but I'll tell you one thing. nobody has ever said this isn't The Witcher.
Oh, like the tone.
Says it on the front.
Yep. God damn it.
Ellen and I will be the first to admit is that out of the four of us that are a part of Roll to Cast, we are definitely less inclined to delve into the nitty-gritty of kind of the rules. And as you can tell by this interview, we kind of steer away from talking about that. But obviously that style of The Witcher and how deadly it is and how you want to avoid combat, if you are able to, because why would you in a world like that? The system informs the style and the style informs the system. And you've obviously found a way to marry the two. And like The Witcher also, we can see is like almost bridging the gap rules-wise from 2020 to what will become Red. But I know it's something that, Cody, you talked about as well, where you say, we want a game that people can get wholly invested in their characters, because then you're going to think twice about whether you go into that battle or if you talk sideways at this person, because there's a very real threat of dying horribly and dying quickly.
Weirdly, that was a two-part part of the inspiration behind the critical injury system in TRPG. Was I wanted to model the brutality of the Witcher setting. I wanted to model this sort of inherently, much more realistic sort of view of combat, whereby a single slip up could mean the end of your life if you're not particularly prepared for it. And modeling things like Geralt getting stabbed in the back by a peasant and killed.
Yeah.
And various things like that. But at the same time, while I wanted to establish that such that you knew that if you were getting into combat, you were in combat. I wanted something that was beyond the you lose 5 hit points, because in my experience with games like that, there is a problem of at a certain point it becomes totally a numbers game of I've got 17 hit points left, I'm probably fine.
Yeah.
But if your character has 17 hit points left, they should be staggering. If you've got 2 hit points left, you are 2 points. A stiff breeze could literally kill you.
Yeah. And what does that feel like as well? That's why broken ribs and
punctured lungs
and what did you get, Sean, in our trial game? Wasn't it sepsis?
Oh yeah, I got
punctured
sepsis.
intestine or something. Yeah,
we trialed. We thought, okay, if we're gonna get into this game, this horrific dark fantasy that Pondsmith has brought to us, let's try the combat system. And I got sepsis from my own dagger.
I mean, spoilers for our own season, but my Witcher dies at the I was going to say hands, but rather the mouth of a catacomb, because I failed. What was it? 3 critical fails. It was the unluckiest dice
hurts.
ever, and she was decapitated. So I feel ya.
It's definitely very swingy, and to some extent, someday I'll probably make some changes to make it a little less swingy, because that's a bit too much crap. But
because I'm confronting you here on this podcast. No, I'm kidding.
Oh God! But the other thing was part of the other reason, the other reason I wanted to have the critical injury system was because it allows for role play. If you walk out of a fight and you just lost 37 hit points, no one is going to remember that fight unless something really cool happened during that fight. Unless you pulled off a very cool stunt or something like that. But if you walk out of a fight and somebody's got broken ribs or somebody's got a punctured lung or something, or you can look back on, remember that time that monster knocked out 6 of my teeth or whatever. You have, rather than this sort of straight numbers game of hit points, you have a very visceral, this is me. This is my body. This is what's happening as I get into these fights. So it felt like you had more of an opportunity to role play than if there was no sort of very visceral, this is your body, this is what's happening to it type system.
In other systems, you have a tendency to walk away from a battle with 2 points, just like you walk away from battle with 20 points. And that's not giving you the flavor of what's actually going on. It's interesting that you mentioned the system being so deadly that maybe you don't want to get into combat, because that is what Michael has been saying ever since the beginning of Cyberpunk. And a lot of people groused when Cyberpunk originally came out because the system was so deadly. But we kept getting letters from cops and vets and people, and they said, no, this is what really happened.
Yeah.
You gotta tell these people. So in both games, we've tried to really get across what's happening rather than just having it be numbers.
In talking about both Cyberpunk and Witcher and how they're both, life is a bit unfair and the odds are often stacked against you, and what people have agency over is themselves, is that it does create this feeling of it is cool to be a cyberpunk. It is cool to be an edge runner, but that coolness is born from a rejection, and it is a choice to kind of flaunt this kind of anti-corporation lifestyle, as opposed to it actually being cool. Like, it's not cool to be a Witcher. He's not the Ubermensch. Yeah. He's a terrible, the most mistreated civil servant ever.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. As playing as a Witcher, I'm like, man, this sucks. This sucks. Everyone hates me, and
no one wants to live here, but we do.
One of the reasons that Cody got the job was because by the time he got to Poland, he had come up with 7 different classes and why you would want to play all of them. Somebody from CDPR said, we've never been able to do that. Everybody just wants to be Witchers.
It's the problem we'd always run across when we got into it originally was what we called the Jedi problem, which is weird because it as you established, it is not the same thing. We have people like, why, it just like Star Wars, everybody wants to be a Jedi. Why wouldn't everybody want to be a Witcher?
Yeah.
And the important part is that Jedi and Witcher are not the same thing.
Yeah.
While their powers are very similar, even in the darkest times of being a Jedi, you are still reasonably respected by society. There is only one time when Witchers are respected by society, and that's because they're necessary, not really because people like them.
Yeah, it's usually when the gold is changing hand.
The closest Witchers have ever gotten to being respected was right after they were made, and that's still dubious.
And it's kind of interesting you point that out. I mean, for the 3 of us with the characters we played, we have a Witcher, one who is feared and hated. We have a mage, one who is not trusted and is generally treated with a hand outstretched, and you've got an elf who is constantly oppressed and discriminated.
You were just a bunch of losers.
Yeah, but in the game.
And it's interesting for myself personally, as someone who basically I only started looking at The Witcher when we decided to play the game. Before that, I had never read a book. I'd never played any of the video games. I'd only then watch the TV series.
Yeah.
So I'm coming at this book completely fresh, and it's being introduced to me. Like, a lot of what I've learnt about the world of The Witcher has come from this book. And it just, the most wholly fascinating thing for me is that no one comes out clean. It's easy for me to look at Nilfgaard and say, oh, yeah, these are the villains of the story. But then I also kind of look at the Northern Kingdoms and I go, oh, the way you treated the elder races is also pretty atrocious. Everyone's kind of shit. And that seems to me to be part of the point. It's dark fantasy. Everyone's kind of their hands are a little bit dirty in one way or another.
I have to admit that I am wearing my Nilfgaardian star shirt.
I know.
I am pro Nilfgaardian simply because I look at it as, do you want Radovic as your king? There are no good kings in the north after the king of Temeria is killed.
It is important because, another aspect of that more sort of, grounded dark fantasy aspect is that, everybody, there's upsides on both sides. If you are in Nilfgaard, you are in, an authoritarian empire. You can just be disappeared off the streets. Nilfgaard also generally treats the elder races better. They have a bit more of a, if you can do the work, you will be respected for the work you can do, but at the same time, they do have, fairly prevalent slavery, primarily of criminals and prisoners of war, but still, And, they do have everything we've seen. They do have, gladiator arenas and stuff like that. So, there's that. But, in the North, you might be freer to do what you want, but that freedom to do what you want means that, you are liable to run across, any number of groups of bandits, or even just members of the aristocracy, even who are just abusing the peasantry because there isn't that very sort of authoritarian, the empire will stop you from, doing this thing if it harms the empire as a whole. And even, Skellige, you are dealing in this absolute, very much more sort of, tightly knit clans who generally look out for each other and stuff like that. But you are in a society that for most of it is founded on raiding other people, and is in many cases an extremely brutal society if you not step out of line, but, oath breakers and kinslayers and stuff like that. So everybody has problems. It's like what I always like to say is that we have in 1272 this interesting situation, this outlook of, the elves are massively persecuted in 1272, and for a lot of their time period. And, humans are nearly wiping them out. In 1272, we often overlook the fact that most of the breeding age elves in the North are gone. So functionally, the elven species is effectively endangered. And it was actually really fascinating because I actually got to play with that one time with a character who was an elf who came across this artifact that was this very powerful, magically imbued artifact that instilled this desire to sort of protect one's own. And I got to really play with the fact that, your species is going extinct.
Yeah.
There's a good chance that in, 70 years, there may not even really be elves in this area. But at the same time, it's important to remember that if you go deep lore on Witcher, the Enshe, the elves that we know, are effectively the less successful version of the N-elf, the elves of the Wild Hunt. And we know from the books and the interactions with the Wild Hunt that the Enshe came to this world as a scouting party, and if things had gone their way, the rest of the elves would have shown up and probably wiped out all of the other species on the continent and taken over. The elves are down now, but if they had been chosen rather than the NL when the elves were escaping the White Frost, it would have been a wildly different story. So, everybody and, the elves themselves are responsible for almost wiping out the Vran, which they did not do because the Vran necessarily came after them. They largely, attacked the Vran to get to, their riches and to take their cities in a lot of circumstances. So it's cycles in a lot of situations.
Remember that Nilfgaard gave them Dol Bothana back.
True, but I would argue that Nilfgaard gave them Dol Bothana back because that inherently destabilizes Eder.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Come on. He doesn't do anything without a purpose.
Yeah.
But we had an inherent problem with elves, which we have never actually addressed. Elves are essentially hunter-gatherers. They don't know anything about agriculture. In the short stories, they are begging people to teach them how to raise crops in the mountains. And yet they were able to build huge cities.
Yeah, that is strange, isn't it? Because
magic.
Okay, never mind. Sean just fixed it.
Well, there are certain things like that. There are things that, in adapting things, there are things where Sapkowski, because of his writing style, in writing the short stories, he would throw little things out, little tidbits, that then would not always make a whole lot of sense in conjunction with everything else. So we'd have to find a way to weave those tidbits into other things. But yeah, I had always figured, the elves don't know a lot about agriculture because, like I said, they were a scouting party to see whether this was going to be a fine place to bring the rest of the elves. So they wouldn't have really had to know a lot about agriculture. And then I think probably I've always figured that it's that the dubiously mysterious elven magic, because elves have a kind of different form of magic, must have done something to help them, or were just leaning on the fact that the continent before humans showed up was massively wild.
Maybe more plentiful.
Yeah, huge forests and probably plentiful, root vegetables and berries and, little rabbits and things like that. No, it's interesting because everybody has blood on their hands. It just kind of depends on where they got it and when, as it were.
I suppose this might be my final question. So I kind of want to make it more sentimental. I just want to know what the other brings to, I mean, especially because it was just the two of you working for Witcher, but even in your other writings and creations and day-to-day managings, what are you most proud of the other for bringing to our Talsorian?
No.
Oh, I just had to do it because we've never had a mother-son combo on the show. It's so exciting.
Never again.
Cody is a game designer, pure and simple. I'm so proud of him because he just went right into this head first. And he does a great job. I could never do what he does. As we've said, he picked this license up when he was 18, brought out a great game, brought out several great books after that. I don't usually say mom stuff, but I'm really proud of him.
That's so lovely to hear.
Throughout the entire process, I've really appreciated that Lisa has brought a certain amount of guidance to it. I was very young when I started this project, and even now, the concept of sort of managing this aspect of the franchise is daunting. There's so much to cover and so much to remember. And throughout the entire process, I was always absolutely speechless at how Lisa could just go through all of Sapkowski's novels and find every bit of information that would be even vaguely useful for the moment at what we're writing, and just give me I have a multi-page list here of all of the notes she took when we were doing Tome of Chaos, and that she could just distill all of this stuff down into this very usable format and really help give me the guidance to kind of stay as close to the sort of the heart of Witcher as we could, and kind of make this massive task very much more manageable. I could not have done this project without you, Lisa.
Oh, thank you. It was a lot of fun.
And kind of speaking of this project that you're heading on with The Witcher, as we're kind of wrapping up towards the end of this episode, this is kind of a point where we throw over if there's anything that you would like to promote, or if there's anything that you either want or can talk about in terms of future projects. Obviously, last year recently you brought out a Book of Tales, which was if I remember right, a collection of 6 adventures in that you can play in The Witcher, which can either be standalones or played as part of a longer campaign. Are there things in the works in terms of The Witcher RPG that you are able to talk about? And if not, are there things that you would like to plug just in general?
Castle Falkenstein when?
You can't say anything about that right now, but we are right at the tail end going into print on our next big Witcher supplement, A Tome of Chaos.
Yes.
Which is our big magic supplement. Really excited for this one to come out and for people to get to see it as we dive into most of the big subjects of magic, like priestly magic, the different gods, mages and how they're trained, druids and what their circles are like, dark magic like summoning devils and mutating people, necromancy, fun stuff like that. It is a really dense book for anyone interested in magic in the world of The Witcher, with a lot of options for players and a lot of cool lore. We got to work with CDPR to write a lot of new lore based around magic in the setting, and we got to write a few deeper descriptions for some of the lesser known gods, and write about how mages are trained in Nilfgaard, and write up a whole bunch of stuff about Goetia and devil summoning and stuff like that.
I mean, it's a mark of the success of the line that CDPR has said that what we do is canon.
Hey,
oh my gosh.
There you go.
That's when I would just start adding really off-the-wall shit. Geralt is my boyfriend. Canon.
Well, the Witcher School of Pondsmith.
Yes.
Oh, wait until the April Fool's Day article.
Oh, I can't wait.
Well, before we say a proper goodbye to you, we will just address the audience quickly because so for all of you listening up, we have closed the door on The Witcher. Sorry, Talsorian. But as we close one door, another one has to open, and so by now. We have, of course, announced what shall be the new season. But if those of you who have not been following us on social media or just didn't hear episodes where we've talked about it, the next game that we will be playing is actually Avatar Legends.
Oh, boy.
The Avatar TTRPG.
Yes.
So from one franchise to another.
Yes, hopefully drastically distinct in tone.
Yes.
I would hope.
We're gonna leave the grim Witcher energy as beautiful as it has been, and hopefully go into a child-friendly adventure.
Which is really funny because we have our old, ye olde Chris, who will be GMing for it. Chris, who last GM'd Vampire the Masquerade for us.
Yes, known from such titles as World of Darkness.
Thank goodness that person has had a certain amount of time to sort of let the vampire stuff go.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where we're heading into. Another franchise that I had no kind of insight. I'd never watched the Avatar before we decided.
Sean lives in a box, I think.
So much so that I called it The Avatar. So there you go.
You really should. I'm sure you can find all the episodes. It's really good.
Oh, I have since.
Yeah. It'd be wild if you didn't do any prep before the podcast, Sean.
I watched the James Cameron film.
I thought you were going to go with the M. Night Shyamalan one.
That one
and
too.
even then I was going to go,
But yeah, so we'll be heading into Avatar Legends as of and with the full book. As Ellen it was part of the Kickstarter.
Yes, I am, and will continue to be, I guess,
Yes.
until it comes out for everyone. But yes.
But yes, obviously, thank you so much to both Cody and Lisa. As always, it's a pleasure to do anything Talsorian related. We've had a chance to do it several times now, and it's always been a rollicking ride.
Yeah, we just love you guys, and as well, your company has supported us so much throughout our podcast endeavors, and yeah, we'd just like to say a real wholehearted thank you.
And thank you for playing our games.
It's kind of like very cool that we get to do this as our hustle. So
also, I think I'm correct on this. Congratulations, Lisa, on is it 40 years of marriage with you and Mike now?
Yes.
Yay!
Amazing.
Congratulations.
40 years.
Aww.
We have been a couple for 44.
Whoa! Amazing. Sorry, I'm shook.
Yeah.
Me, who's like knows someone for like 12 years, and I'm like, they might still hate me. Don't know.
You have ups and downs when you're married for 40 years, but overall, I think it's been great. When I got together with Michael, I was 21, I think it was, and I said, you know what? I don't know what this guy's going to do, but it's going to be interesting. Whatever it is, it's going to be really interesting. So I found that very attractive.
Oh my God.
I think that's the note we have to leave
That's
on.
the funniest thing. That's so wonderful. It's the best thing I've ever heard.
We don't know what you both are going to do, but for now, we will leave you, bid you adieu. And Cody and Lisa, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
You have been listening to The Blood-Soaked Rose, which is a Roll-to-Cast production. The best way to find us is on Twitter, Discord, and our Patreon. All our podcasts are on Acast, Spotify, YouTube, and all good podcatchers. You can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/roll-to-cast. The Witcher tabletop role-playing game is property of Talsorian Games. Used with permission.